Victorian period. Queen Victoria reigns from the mid 1800s. She dies in the early 1900s, and suddenly we are thrust into the modern period. So we're going to focus really quickly on the changes from the Victorian period to the modern period. The Victorian period ends with the British pretty much at the height of its power. I mean, there's a phrase, a saying from the Victorian period that says that the sun never sets on the British Empire. I think that's an important phrase for you to record. The sun never sets on the British Empire. And what it means is that by the end of Victoria's reign, they have colonized so much of the world, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, of course in Canada, etc., that literally wherever you go, the sun is shining on some part that Britain holds. And so they're at the height of their power. They have colonies in China, in India, in the majority of Africa. There's been great social reform. There's been wonderful advancements in technology. And so we really end the Victorian period, and we're kind of this little guy standing here, I can do it. Everything's great. And then in 1914, you know what happened. It's the beginning of World War I. Now, World War I begins really this idea of the modern period, and there are three historical events that really define this period, and they are, of course, World War I, World War II, and then there's a great economic recession throughout the world. I think that we typically tend to focus on the Great Depression in America, but we have to understand that that certainly had a ripple effect in economies all over the world. And World War I really damaged economies as well, and you'll learn about that more in world history and kind of how that had major repercussions, especially in Germany, Italy, etc. So the beginning of the modern period, we're very defeated. I mean, the title for World War I at the time, they didn't call it that. They called it the Great War. And they called it that because they didn't think that we would ever be stupid enough to have a second one. So you have to think about what World War I meant to the British. First of all, we've got all of these new technologies being introduced: machine guns, submarines, tanks, mustard gas. I mean, imagine how this makes them view the world. Suddenly we're using technology not to improve lives, but to end lives. I mean, think about how terrifying mustard gas must have been for the very first time. They've gone off to war, and suddenly you can die just by breathing the air around you. That's terrifying. That's just absolutely terrifying. The other thing to consider are tanks. I mean, imagine what it must have been like to see a tank rolling towards you for the very first time. A big metal box on wheels is coming towards you with a big gun pointed straight at you. I mean, it probably was absolutely horrifying. So the modernist period really begins to question the world. What are we coming to? What have we done? What's the state of humanity when this is what we are, when this is what we're using our resources for? And that really begins to show in modernist literature. So when we talk about the themes of modernist literature, we really have to understand that these are all based out of that feeling of desperation and kind of bewilderment coming from the onslaught of World War I. So the first thing we're looking at is this idea of alienation and isolation. And that references this sense of feeling alone and abandoned by society and the world. And it's this idea that, the government doesn't care about us. They've shipped us off to places that we've never been to without the supplies that we need, and this is what we've come to. So there's this real sense of isolation that will come through the literature. Dissatisfaction with the world around them. It's this feeling that nothing can be done to help society, and they express that unhappiness with the direction of the world by creating the ridiculous or the irreverent. So it's kind of this idea that, everything in the world, it has kind of gone to hell in a handbasket. So why should I look at this piece of art and say, well, yes, this is what defines beauty, when that's not necessarily what I see as beautiful right now. So they look at this idea of the ridiculous or the irreverent. Disillusionment, the discovery that everything is not as it seems. And this is a really big one to begin to look at in modernist literature. The idea that the British Empire is not always right. We're going to see this a lot in some of our post-colonial literature. So literature that's being written in Africa and in India, and the realization that the British government has at times done more harm than good. Okay, so this disillusionment, everything is not as it seems. Our government is not protecting us the way that we thought it would. The world does not appear to operate the way that we thought it would. Denunciation of traditional values, beliefs, and ideals. And this is really coming out of this idea that if the old ways didn't work, why should we continue to follow them? You know, the old ways were what got us into the mess of World War I to begin with. And so if that's what we were doing, then why in the world would we want to continue that? Instead, we need to make it new. Okay, and that phrase, I want you to highlight that. It really becomes a battle cry for the modernist movement, to make it new, to try things we've never done before, to take risks. There's this great quote, if you've ever seen the Broadway musical Rent. It's one of my favorites. And there's this great quote in one of the songs that says that the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. And I've always loved that. That's always really stuck with me because of how profoundly true that is. You know, war destroys. It destroys, you know, landscapes and homes and cities and people and lives. And what the modernists sought to do was to create, was to somehow retain humanity through creation. And then this last one is the idea of the chaos in the world. And this is very specifically related to the imperial decline of Britain. And so when the indigenous peoples of the colonies that they have gone to begin to protest and begin to rebel. And so we begin to see the retaliation and the effect of colonization. And so that one we're going to look at in a couple of different ways, not only in terms of the damaging effects of war, but also the damaging effects of colonization.